Thank you, Kelly, for the introduction, and we'll get started. Thank you, Hector, for joining. I know you're super busy, and thanks for being such a great sport and
It's my pleasure.
helping the cause. So first of all, how are you? How are you doing? You just
I'm all
moved?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, things are okay. Just living life and hanging out here with you early in the morning. I'm not a morning person, so goes to show you how special you are, Rajat. Okay,
Well, thanks for being here.
of
Um,
course.
Well, thanks, Kelly, for the introduction, Hector's introduction. I just wanted to add that he brings kind of a unique perspective, being on both sides of the cybersecurity, black hat side, and white hat side, which I find it quite interesting, intriguing, and it's kind of rare, at least for me. So we'll try to use this time as much as possible to talk about kind of both sides of the equation. Um, Also, like, despite his notoriety, he's just an amazing guy to hang out with, and he's just an amazing friend. I've known him for several years. Actually, he helped me with tips to publish my first book. And actually, I attributed the book to him. He's one of the persons. I don't know if you know Hector that or not,
I
but
didn't know that, but I would love my signed copy, brother,
yeah,
please.
I'll send it to you. So I have zero cybersecurity experience. I know a little bit here and there, but I'm familiar with the vulnerabilities that mobility-related systems have, and we'll touch on that today. Most of our listeners are from mobility space, so we'll stay to the topic. Again, thanks for being here, Hector. You want to say something really quick before we start off?
Well, I would say the first thing is that I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be able to support you and your organization on you guys taking charge of not only having these conversations and getting I would say great minds together for these conversations, but also talking about cybersecurity. I mean, cybersecurity and car security, automotive security has been an interesting topic. You've had very good history. Fortunately, your industry has had some great researchers like Sammy Kamkar and Charlie Miller and all these very talented people that looked at automotive security very early on when infotainment systems were being added to cars, when the controller area network was expanding and a lot of cars became modern, right, quote unquote. So I think that we are in a very good spot because those early researchers jumped on early. And I think that as we continue to move forward, hopefully we inspire new researchers to come in and work in tandem with these car companies and car manufacturers to improve the security posture. And I think I'm very happy to be part of the conversation. I'm looking forward to having this free flowing conversation with you.
Yeah, great. All right, so Hector, I've been wanting to ask this question to you. I haven't asked this in our offline conversations. So you went from black hat to white hat, and I know you through our mutual friend Art. I wanted to ask you about the transition, right? The transition that you had to go through from being a black hat to white hat. What was the transition like? Like, it's were you relieved that you were on the good side of the law, or were you worried about the backlash from the community that you're part of?
Well, it is a great question. For the most part, I would say that I was someone. For those of you that don't know, yes, I was a black hat, and I'm not here to glorify that. By the way, I'm not proud of that time. I'm actually more proud of what I'm doing now, helping people and mentoring and advising, rather than what I did back then. Um, but you also have to look at the timing of the situation. Listen. I got online in the mid '90s. The security industry, even though right now it seems pretty large, but it's still an infant essentially when you compare it to like the weapons industry or you compare it to plane manufacturing, right? The cybersecurity industry is very young, and so the industry itself was very hard to get into unless one you were coming out the military or two, you were, buddies with people that were already in the industry. So I was someone that was trying to, at some point, become a professional. I wanted to make it a career. In the early 2000s, I would say 2004 or three, I partnered up with a Swedish hacker called the Shadow Integer. Very mysterious sounding, but very nice guy. Excuse me. And we created a kind of like a red team boutique out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And I tried to be a professional in the scene, but you also have to understand, by then, by the 2000s, I had already done a bunch of hacktivism. I already was the bad guy, and I was trying to break free from that. Unfortunately, I could not make it into the industry. I mean, the first requirement was that you need,
Security clearance.
Huh?
Security clearance.
You need security clearances, or at the very least, some sort of, certificate of something, or education of something. I was all self-taught.
Yeah.
And, even when I went on the interviews, the people looked at me like, who's this guy? Why is he walking into the office? And, it was just a very hard time for me. Now, I was able to take my skills and experience and apply it to a different industry, which was IT. And my first real job, my first set of jobs, was as a systems administrator. Okay. Because in order for me to learn how to hack, I had to hack to learn. Shout out to my friend Brute Logic, who uses that's just kind of his phrase. I had to really understand Unix and how to run a system in order to compromise it. So since I've learned that, I was able to apply it to like a system admin job here in New York, and from there it was fine. As we move forward into the 2010s is when I got back into hacktivism. Those are all bad choices on my end, right? I was depressed. I needed an outlet, and I made the mistake of partnering up with Anonymous and being part of the creation of LawSec, and it led me to having to knock on the door. But let me tell you something, Rajat. The knock on the door by the FBI was the best thing to ever happen to me.
You haven't said that before. Like,
Yeah.
I haven't heard that before, but go ahead.
Oh yeah, well, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because one of the things that people don't like to talk about in regards to that era of Anonymous and LawSec and so on is that we were all becoming radicalized collectively. It was no longer a simple, hey, let's go down the street and protest the Church of Scientology. It was more of like, hey, we're going to cause or be a part of or infiltrate or, either cause a revolution or infiltrate a foreign government. But it was all turning backwards. It was all like, okay, we're going to start in Tunisia and then Egypt and Libya and Syria. Okay, now it's time for the United States. Okay. And so it was becoming radical. In a sense, I was radicalized. I wouldn't say as extreme as others, because even I go on Twitter, I look on Twitter, and there's still people from that era still spewing that anonymous stuff, right?
Yeah,
it's still we're talking about a decade later, okay? And I feel bad for these people, and I hope that someday they do get a reality check the same way I did it, which was to get a knock on the door. And I was fortunate that the guy, the agent that arrested me, they call him like the Elliot Ness of cybercrime, which is Chris Tarbell. He knocked on my door and he said, look, I'm going to tell you something. Before I even knocked on your door, you have 12 people pointing their fingers at you. You're dealing with an organization of people that are not really about this life. And are you really prepared to spend the rest of your life in prison for a bunch of people that don't really care about you? They didn't even like you. And that's true, because once the news came out that I was Sabu, and people saw my skin color and people saw the way I looked, immediately it went to race. Immediately was like, oh, look at this guy, he's a S word, right?
Yeah.
Or he's all these different words. And I was like, wow, okay, so I'm glad I made the right decision. So it was a hell of a ride, and I'm glad that now I could take my experience and my skills and push it towards people that are trying to get into the industry now.
Yeah,
I never had that.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm mentoring at least 4 people as we speak. We have several interns in my organization, and part of my day-to-day is advising brand new cybersecurity startups, and I'm happy.
Yeah. So I remember talking with Art in 2000, about 2015 or 16, that you and Art, talked to some system administrator and showed them their vulnerability. And Art, I remember Art saying that they didn't want to hear about it. Is that is that still the case in the industry, especially among the system administrators and the uh, back DevOps?
Well, I
Like
mean,
they're afraid of exposing themselves of all the vulnerabilities.
that's a great question, right? I think things have changed drastically over the last couple of years because of ransomware groups, right? There was a time, you're absolutely right. There was a time when an organization would rather stay quiet about their breach than not, until state attorneys or attorney generals across the United States, from California to New York, began, I would say, they began, exposing some of these organizations and taking them to court. Right now, there's laws where if there is a data breach, you have to alert your users, your consumers, and if you do not, then there can be all sorts of fines and legal actions. So now organizations are more prone to communicate their breaches. I'd also say because of the ransomware attacks, now we have an entirely new part of our industry, which is cyber insurance and insurance companies, where something like that cannot, go under the rug anymore. Now there are policies in place. There are, all sorts of, requirements and check marks that need to be checked in order to be compliant with your provider. So yeah, things have changed drastically. If you would ask me this question 2-3 years ago, before the ransomware craze, I would have said, yeah, people are still hiding it. The people are still kind of like laying low. It is a problem in our industry, but I think that's changing.
Yeah. So the in one of your recent interviews, I think it was PC Editor, one of the interviews that you did last year, you mentioned something that caught my attention, was how the exploits, the attack vectors, the payloads have changed from when you first started and what it is now. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, when I first got online in the 1990s, I remember all I had to do was go on IRC, FNet to be specific. That was a network at the time, or it still is. And you would bump into the right people, and you would get access to, what they call zero-day exploits that were researched and developed by previous groups or other groups like the Team Tessos and the LSDPLs, right? Last Stage of Delirium of Poland. And these groups were phenomenal. They were amazing. They were, in I would say, in so many words, geniuses. Those exploits, range from local privilege escalation all the way up to remote routes, remote command execution. What those exploits meant in those days was getting access to pretty much anything you wanted, right? Before the vulnerabilities were patched. Then there was a point where, world governments and corporations began to work together to monetize this security research and vulnerabilities. It's also why it might explain to your audience why something like Eternal Blue. I'm sure you guys remember this. It was part of the cache of exploits that were released several years ago, leaked several years ago. Eternal Blue, when you look at it, seems to be a vulnerability that existed in Windows for quite some time. Okay, but then it only came out several years ago as part of a leak, which tells us that at the very least, one government had access to it. They had access to that zero-day vulnerability. They were aware of its capabilities. They were aware of how to use it, and they weaponized it. At that point, an Eternal Blue exploit was probably worth, like, this is me throwing numbers out because I'm going by like Zerodium's numbers. Zerodium is a kind of like a middleman reseller of exploits and vulnerabilities, but that could be considered like $1 million exploit. So you had these groups no longer kind of providing those exploits publicly. They would now begin to sell their research to a broker that would then resell it to a government. Now, as we fast forward in time, now we're in 2021, and things have changed again. If you are part of a ransomware group, or you are part of that community, and you have enough, connections, or if you are, on a very specific path, and I'm gonna get to that in a second, you may get these sort of same exploits again. I saw that Google Security released a report several months ago where they identified one campaign that utilized over 20 zero-day attacks. And these were all related to web browser, mostly web browser attacks in Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and so on. That is insane. That is insane. Because for a long time, those kind of exploits were kind of like, anachronisms from another time. They were kind of like, does that even exist? Is there a remote, Chrome exploit out there that we don't know about? But we're seeing the frequency of these exploits being used more and more often, which tells us that either there's a lot of rich people out there spending money on exploits and using it for these malicious campaigns, or maybe black hats or researchers or governments are giving these exploits, these ransomware groups, for the sole purpose of either one, creating some sort of chaos and destruction, but two, also for monetization reasons, right?
Sure.
If you're able to ransomware, let's say like a Toyota, and really impact their systems, is Toyota going to take the loss and just say, okay, we're going to start the network all over again? Or are they going to pay $10 to $20 million to get their files back, or at least get their systems back online, right? It's a complicated situation. We're starting to see that modus operandi and methodologies for all these different groups are starting to merge more and more every day, and attribution becomes more and more of a problem. So I hope I answered your question, but yeah, man, it's a very tough situation to be in right now.
So do you see that those exploits changing, and are there kind of future exploits coming into your radar that we've not seen before and that we should be aware of?
Well, that's the thing. So are they going to change? No, I mean, we're going to see more use of zero-day exploits and vulnerabilities, rather. We're going to see more of that. The thing is, we don't really know who these researchers are. We don't really know what they're looking at or what they're looking for. These researchers could be, a kid in Utah, or, a grown man in Romania, right? They're probably just trying to monetize their research and their time. They don't really care where their research goes or what it does.
Yeah.
It's up to the buyer of those exploits to kind of figure it out. For example, we have no idea if there is a research group focusing on automotive security right now, looking for automotive exploits. Right. I know a lot of vehicles are using QNX. I love QNX. I think QNX is so awesome, right? It's an embedded operating system. It's really fast. It's really cool. I know a lot of automotive, or rather car makers actually use QNX in some of their systems. But if you look at the security history of QNX, it's had a very colorful past when it comes down to security vulnerabilities. I'm not sure if that's improved since then, but we need to start looking at the fact that researchers may be looking at QNX and other similar systems, embedded systems, for issues.
Yeah, so for the participants from auto industries, make sure you call your QNX vendor, ask those questions. I'm sure they are, but it's good to know. And so the past couple of years, I mean, you mentioned you've been advising companies and you've been helping. You're also doing pen testing, right? And red teams. What's been your experience so far right now? Like what are the top 3 mistakes that these companies tend to make across the board, and how do you help them?
That's another great question, because in 2021, I'm still seeing things like password security or password policy issues, asset management issues. I would say, okay, if I were to give you the top 3, I would say number 1 is definitely not understanding your infrastructure. And that's very specific to the Windows domain. I've seen many internal Windows domains that are misconfigured, or are pretty lax in terms of configuration. And that's the most common issue you're going to deal with. You're going to look at things like Kerber roasting, or you're going to look at things like, being able to intercept name translations through LLMNR. You use something as simple as responder.py to compromise elements of a $1 billion company, right? The those kind of Windows specific misconfigurations or configurations that are enabled by default that can be detrimental to your security posture is the number one common thing I'm seeing. The second one I'm going to say is policy, a lack of backup policy and a lack of asset management. There are some organizations that have no idea what they're running. I had one client, legit, and it's not me exaggerating or anything like that. I had one customer hit me up literally right after SolarWinds and say, "Hey, we need a pen test. We don't know if we have SolarWinds on our infrastructure. We really don't know." And we could sit here and joke around and laugh about it, but no, it's a very serious thing because there are a lot of organizations that really don't know what they have.
Why don't they know what they have? Is it because they use a lot of these open source tools, or just like tools that they've used like 10 years ago and they've been hiding in plain sight?
So I would say that a lot of legacy environments, a lot of legacy infrastructures, and we're talking, when I say legacy, I'm talking about, let's say your business built the infrastructure. And I'm talking about an internal network with remote offices and VPN configurations, right? You guys created that 20 years ago, 15 years ago, okay? Since then, you have done no asset management. You have no idea what it is you're running. There's nothing that's labeled. You have servers running in your office that are sitting in a closet with no labels on them. You have no idea who runs them. And then you're also not managing who connects to your internal network and kind of set access controls to limit what can be added to your network. For example, a major concern always, and I've heard this since literally the late 90s, shadow IT, right? Shadow IT is when, you come to your business with your own cell phone, and then you connect your cell phone to the network. And now, you have a brand new device on the network that has no connection to the business. The IT support or IT in general do not have any idea why this phone is on the network. And if this network, if that phone is compromised, now it is a liability to your organization. How does your IT guy support that? How is the security personnel supposed to deal with that, right? So a lot of organizations began, especially now, back in those days, it was just basically track down who owns this device and let's block the MAC address from the switch or from the ports, from the routers. Let's set a blacklist on a DHCP server, so these MAC addresses cannot connect to the network, right?
Yeah.
But it's very tedious. Now organizations are moving into like the least trust or zero trust concepts, which is a whole new other beast, a whole new other monster. And I think that as we move forward, right, beyond this point, you're going to see organizations try to either eliminate or migrate away from their legacy infrastructure. So I'm going to give you one last example here. More recently, I did an internal red team in an organization. They're not that big. I would say medium-sized company. And I was actually impressed by the fact that they migrated away from their internal Active Directory and internal domain and migrated away to the cloud using Azure Active Directory or Azure AD, right?
Yeah.
So most, you might turn around and say, "Hey, Hector, but isn't it more isn't it more, I would say, risky to move your internal domain to something like Azure?" Yeah, absolutely. But you're also eliminating most of the common internal threats that you would deal with if you're running your own on-prem Active Directory environment. So it's like we're all trying to figure this out. We need to figure it out as a community. So
yeah, so out of the first one, which is more of not knowing your configurations and not knowing their infrastructure. Second one is kind of lack of policy, asset management that you mentioned. What's the third one?
Yeah, so I would say lack of policy, and that includes, asset management. That includes, whether or not you have risk assessments taking place, and of course, backup policy, right? Backup policy is a major part of it. The fact that a lot of organizations do not have a solid backup plan, okay, is also why ransomware is becoming so rampant. It's becoming so successful for these groups to execute and engage on, because I will guarantee you that if, had we started discussing backups more seriously back in the 90s and 2000s, I would think that ransomware would probably be less effective today. But because we kind of just winged it as a community, right? And we winged it and said, okay, well, we need a backup server. Yeah, we could just buy Veeam. Veeam is a great software, or Pure Storage, right? let's just buy that and let's call it a day. Let it do automatic backups every day. Okay, cool. But then you look at the Veeam server on the inside, and it's not secured, right? It's accessible from anybody. Depending on how you configure your backup storage, it would be accessible over something like NFS, which I've seen. I've seen a Veeam backup server accessible over NFS, which allowed me to mount backups directly from the backup server and actually have write access to that same NFS mount. Insanity, right? So I would really point to number 3 being implementation. Okay. And implementation is going to encompass all 3 issues. If you're going to implement a Windows on-prem internal, Windows environment, you really have to focus on how you're going to implement it, how you're going to configure it. Do our users really need to add 10 computers to the network? Let's limit that down to 2, right? That's actually Windows default, by the way. Are we going to really use NTLM authentication on the network? Well, let's use Kerberos instead. Yeah. So implementation is very important, but this also applies to the car, the car security, right? You could have a Tesla, which is a very modern company, build out a whole new generation of vehicles, but their implementation of their entertainment system or the infotainment system, is not done right. There are issues with it. Maybe there's some OTA issues that they haven't addressed. So yeah, implementation is extremely important. You have to really think it through.
Have you studied the Tesla's OTA issues and infotainment? Possible
I would say
infotainment
cursory.
exploits?
Yeah, I would say a cursory of different systems, right? Not only Tesla, but Chrysler and all these different companies. I would say that it's been an interesting ride for the most part, and I wish I would have got into this field very early on. Back when, like I said before, like when Sammy and Charlie Miller were doing their things, right? I wish I would have gotten into it before, because I think I would have learned a lot more and probably been in the industry longer.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I had was, I've been reading. I mean, we all use a lot of open source tool like npms, and so there's quite a bit of buzz that some of these open source binaries are like, are compromised, right, already. And so is that an issue that you're seeing more and more?
What, the use of open source tools?
Yeah, there's lots of open source and not knowing what's inside it, whether it's a compromise or not.
I mean, that is a great question. So open source is fantastic. And I think the concept, aside from having free software and distributing free software, rather providing access to software to people for free, is fantastic. I also like the fact that open source software is collaborative. That's fantastic. But there is something that I'm sure many of you have noticed, that over time, someone is going to release an amazing library, right? Amazing library is going to blow your mind. Maybe someone releases an automotive specific library that is used by half the industry by the end of the year. And it works very well, and it allows access to the CAN, or it allows access to do all these different things. But once that developer disappears, it is up to the community to maintain the software.
Yeah.
And if the community is just lazy or not interested in actually actively developing that library, then it becomes obsolete, and then it becomes dormant. Yeah. Now, there's nothing wrong with dormant code. I mean, I can almost guarantee you, that most of the code or libraries running on some of your systems are obsolete by at least 5 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or not obsolete, but dormant by at least 5 years.
Right.
It doesn't mean that the code is bad, but what it does mean is that when you start packaging, let's say you create an application for your vehicle, is written in Java, right? Is developed in Java, and you're including various amounts of libraries. Now, let's say out of 1,000 libraries you have included in your application, one of them has a security vulnerability, a very, very deep seeded issue. Maybe a deserialization bug, maybe it's some sort of XXE or XML entities issue. Um, and it's part of like a dormant library. It's been there for like 7 years. Yeah. Um, you know, how would you know about that? Well, if you have a solid DevOps security process and you're keeping up to date with what library versions you're using, then you may be aware that you're using a vulnerable version of that library. If that library is dormant to the point where the developer does not even sign in no more, makes no security changes, then at that point you or the community may have to modify and fix that library on its own. Okay, now let's move forward beyond that. All right. So now here you are, you're a car manufacturer, you created this awesome application. It's running on Java or some sort of derivative. And one of the libraries within that application is vulnerable to a major issue. You're not aware. It's a zero-day attack. And in your mind, you're thinking, well, is this a library? We're just calling a function from it. There's no way for an attacker to get access to that. But that's on the contrary. Using what they call like gadgets. An attacker would be able to somehow, and it's not impossible, somehow be able to call the vulnerable function and exploit that issue. That's deep-seated, hidden within your code. If you do not have a legitimate, and when I say legitimate, I mean basically like a solid, like an organized DevOps security program, then you're not even going to know that you're vulnerable. And you just basically have a massive application with tons of libraries in it, and you don't know where you stand, right?
So that circles back to your comment about knowing your assets, right? Which is
Absolutely. I mean, we could approach DevOps security very similarly with asset management. Have an idea as to what libraries you're including in your software, and if and this is a big if someone actually reports the vulnerability upstream to MITRE or to rather NIST or any of the organizations that develop or generate CVEs, then yeah, you may have an understanding, if you have a solid DevOps security program, of the security posture of your application. If nobody reports that CVE or that issue and it remains a 0-day, then yes, your application will remain vulnerable. The reality is that this is why a lot of organizations, even though it becomes very expensive, tend to develop everything. And if they have to rewrite a library, they will. But I love open source. Don't get me wrong. Without open source, I don't think we would have gotten here.
Yeah, absolutely.
We would have been stuck in Windows NT still, that era. Yeah.
So I'm going to change the subject a little bit. So we in MOBI, we talk a lot about supply chain, and basically what we mean by that is how we move our packages between different vendors and different entities and different suppliers and all that. You and I talked about is that there's a new phrase called software supply chain attacks, right? Basically the vulnerability travels from one entity to another entity and they don't even know it's happening. I think that was part of the SolarWinds attack, right? So what's your take on this whole supply chain attack?
Well, it's very real. It's definitely not theoretical. We've had several major supply chain attacks over the last 20 years. And I'm going to give you guys a history lesson because I am, I'm a nerd.
Go for it.
And I'm kind of like a hacker historian in a way. I love reading and kind of absorbing this stuff. So I would say that one of the first ones that I remember was when RSA got compromised. And remember, I'm not sure if you remember, Rajat, but back in the days, government and military and major corporations, you would use these RSA keys, right? And when you had to log into a system, you had to press the button, it would generate a number. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's we had MFA at a critical time in our lives, or in our history rather. But that kind of got torpedoed by the fact that somebody, it's alleged it was a Chinese hacker, had compromised RSA and they got access to like the seed, the seed that would generate those keys. And because of that, that is a supply chain attack right there. It compromised pretty much everybody that used the RSA tokens. And I'm sure you noticed after that, the whole physical MFA thing kind of disappeared, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you had Juniper. Juniper, the manufacturer of like routing and networking devices, they were compromised by the infamous Sun Tzu backdoor, where again, it was alleged that Chinese hackers, it was always Chinese or Russian hackers, by the way. Okay. It was alleged that Chinese hackers broke into Juniper and they backdoored very specific VPN code that would allow an attacker to essentially decrypt VPN and voice communications, VoIP communications. And the backdoor password was Sun Tzu. Okay. But now let's go into the modern era. Several years ago, CC Cleaner, which is an open source tool, not open source, but a free freeware type of tool that allows organizations kind of clean up systems, or it's part of like the general IT cleanup package or whatever. That organization, the developers were compromised in a very sophisticated attack. And when I say sophisticated, I don't mean these guys, the attackers use like $1 million 0-day remote root access exploit. Instead, they were able to identify who the developers were for the CC Cleaner project. They were able to then compromise these developers, get access to the developer network, get access to the source code of CC Cleaner, and they were able to not only backdoor CC Cleaner, but build and distribute a fully functional CC Cleaner binary that was backdoored. And then not only that, CC Cleaner at that point was downloaded by like an additional 2 million people or some crazy number, but they only affected less than 100 machines. Yeah. You have to ask yourself, well, why? Were these guys inefficient in how they backdoored the application? No. They were very specific. They only wanted computers that were running CC Cleaner from Intel, from Microsoft, from AMD.
Yeah.
It's a very specific target attack. They didn't care about Rajat's computer, but they would care about Rajat's computer. The Rajat was connected to the Intel.com network. Okay. Now that, my friend, is a real supply chain attack that was very effective, and it was found by accident. Okay. You move to SolarWinds. Oh, go ahead, please.
Who found it?
I don't know, a researcher, I guess, or I have to look into it. It's been a while. It's been a couple years. That was like 4 years ago, I believe. It could have been a vendor, EDR vendor. It could have been a researcher. Somebody figured it out. And the sophistication and methodology only is what made that attack extremely successful. Okay. But SolarWinds was very similar. SolarWinds was compromised, I think, by VPN or somebody logged into one of their admin portals, using like SolarWinds 123 or some crazy, ridiculous password. I might be confusing that with Colonial Pipeline, by the way. But the truth of the matter is that you're seeing a pattern. You're seeing a pattern here, right? You have these organizations that are developing and deploying and distributing, disseminating applications or information to a mass amount of people that are being, and then of course they're being targeted and compromised using seemingly mundane and low-level vulnerabilities, the low-hanging fruits. All right. We have yet to see a truly sophisticated remote 0-day attack against, like, for example, I'll give you a good example. So you remember when Equifax was compromised?
Yeah.
Right. That was a whole big story. And Equifax was compromised by means of a Apache Tomcat. I could be wrong. It was definitely an Apache server. And the vulnerability itself was a 1-day. What that means is that the security community had already distributed information about the vulnerability, and the community was aware that this software version specifically was vulnerable to attack. If Equifax had a legitimate or solid asset management policy in place, they would have identified that, one, they had a vulnerable piece of software running. Two, it was a remote command execution, which means that the CVSS score was going to be rather high. It's a critical remote command execution vulnerability, and they need to update or take that server offline immediately. Okay. But what did we see? They did not, and they were compromised. And I'm not here to admonish any of these companies, by the way, but it's great to have these conversations.
Yeah, sure.
Because, you know, it's like, for example, we could bring it back to automotive, right? So what is it, 2015, when Charlie Miller and his research partner identified the problem with the Jeep's Uconnect, right?
Yeah.
That was an issue that, you know, they thoroughly investigated. They thoroughly put together their research on. They even did a proof of concept on the highway or in the streets, and they were able to remotely hijack the vehicle, right? Or not hijack it, but either accelerate and stop the vehicle and so on.
Yeah, drive the vehicle, right?
Drive the vehicle and so on, right? That was, I think a lot of us remember that because it was a major issue. You know, it's good to talk about these things so that we do not kind of repeat history.
Yeah, but then I had this when that was happening, I had this conversation with a couple of researchers, not cybersecurity researchers, but they were saying, oh, this is not practically feasible. You know, you need to have this and that doesn't happen in the real world, blah blah blah. They were trying to kind of, you know, hand wave as though it's not a big deal, and it was just trying to make a noise for themselves.
Well, there's always going to be someone that's going to say something about something. There's always going to be an opinion. Everybody got an opinion. The truth of the matter is that, you know what, Charlie Miller was already known. He was already a researcher. He was already known in the industry, right? I don't know him personally, but I respect his work. And in that case, he highlighted a very real attack. Yes, you needed access to what? I think the attack was to like the Sprint network. There was some capability, some networking issue there that allowed someone to access the Uconnect, right? And I think it required, in his case, a man-in-the-middle attack. Could be wrong. But the truth of the matter is, it's like, okay, so it doesn't matter how corny it looked or how infeasible it may have been at the time. He proved it works. So now let's look at how we handle these protocols. Let's look at, well, do we need our cars to be connected through, you know, some sort of Sprint network, or are we going to use something like, remember you and I were talking about a long time ago, we were talking about pinging information back and forth using like a LoRaWAN or something like that as you're driving down a network, right? We'll talk about that.
Yeah, I'm going to have a question on that in just a moment.
Yeah.
Right. So basically, no, go ahead. Finish.
Yeah. So are we gonna decentralize these vehicles and just create a massive network of mesh devices all across the highways, all across the US, and these cars will kind of be beacons with these devices, and so we're gonna have a massive mesh network, which I think personally is probably more secure, but it could also be problematic, right? It could be chaotic as well.
Sure.
Again, where do we go back to implementation? Implementation is always very important here. But yeah, so, you know, but look at Sammy, right? So Sammy Camcar was another one. 2016, 2017. He discovered the issue with OnStar, right? And I believe that the OnStar issue was he was able to intercept and or hijack like the OnStar account for the vehicle, and then essentially log into the vehicle and turn it off, right? Yeah. Again, I could be wrong. But again, these are things that we could say, okay, regardless of how you feel about Charlie Miller and Sammy Camcar and how they did the research, you can say, wow, okay, now we have some perspective as to attack methodologies, potential capabilities. And did we think about that before? Did we ever think that someone would hijack an OnStar account? Did we ever think it was possible to get access or do a man-in-the-middle attack against a Sprint network or against a device in our vehicles to intercept cars over the Sprint network? You know, so yeah, it's fortunately in this case, the researchers did a very good job of kind of highlighting those issues. Imagine if these were nation state actors.
Yeah.
Right? Imagine if they found out that, you know, at the time, Obama had a Jeep. You know, he likes his Jeep, and he would drive around with the Jeep in the highway. And, you know, you have a nation state actor essentially physically driving maybe a couple of cars behind the Secret Service and shutting off the Jeep in the middle of the highway. I mean, these are all radical examples, but the reality is we have to think about these examples.
But they showed scenarios. It was possible, right? They showed it was possible.
That's all you need, right? Now you know it's possible. Well, what can we do to mitigate these possible issues? Yeah.
Yeah. and then so that brings me to that mesh network that you're talking about. And there's been, at least I know for the last 10 years that I've been working at the university, about this V2X communication, right? Between vehicles using 5.9 gigahertz DSRC, low latency peer-to-peer communication, to send data back and forth from their internal systems, that would facilitate like rapid braking, truck platooning, car platooning things. And then also V2X would be like V2I or I2V, that the vehicles talk to the infrastructure, roadside infrastructure, to communicate weather information, congestion information directly into the vehicles, doing over-the-air updates. So there's been quite a bit of investment on that, especially from the US government side, and in Europe and Japan. Japan is, I think, thought of as kind of a leader on that space. Have you been studying that space, like in terms of security vulnerabilities?
Yeah, of course. I mean, thanks to you. I mean, you're the one that introduced me to that concept, right? And it actually it kind of spiraled me into an entirely new field of research, which is mesh networking. I mean, if you look at my closet, I have a ton of LoRaWAN equipment. I know that there's different protocols, there's different specifications. I went with LoRa. I thought LoRa was cool. The potential for long range communications, clear views. Probably not practical for something like what we're talking about. But it really opened my eyes to mesh networking and decentralization, and the distribution of information. I think for weather stuff would be great, right? But now remember, as we're implementing new protocols, as we're developing new software, now we need to make sure, and this is a great opportunity because I know that the industry is still very young here. Rather, this specific portion of the industry is very young. We need to make sure that as we're developing software as a community, we're doing it right. And for example, the Devops security process is going to be very important here, right? I think that there's a lot of benefits to it. I wouldn't want to send any sensitive information over this kind of mesh network. It would have to be very generic, general information, like, hey, there's an accident coming up, or hey, I have bad brakes. Maybe give an alert to the guy in the back, like, hey, chill out, don't speed up, don't tailgate me or whatever. Very generic information would be fantastic. Anything beyond that, I obviously as a security practitioner, I would not really push for.
Yeah, now when you mentioned that, we did an experiment in College Station, Texas, where we tested this frequency, the 5.9 gigahertz, to basically hop the messages between cars. So if I'm a car, like I want to send the message to two cars ahead of me, you can bounce those messages. And now when we think about the supply chain attack, this scares me, kind of like, what could that happen? What could that do, right?
Well, so let's think about it. Now let's think about it, right? Because you could have a supply chain attack here, right?
Right.
So let's say we have a test environment. There's three vehicles. The first vehicle is good. The last one is also good, but the guy in the middle, the vehicle in the middle, is the bad one, right? That's the rogue actor.
Right.
If they're able to identify a vulnerability in your mesh network implementation or the software or whatever, if there is no form of authentication or authorization or checksumming or anything, let's say we're just a straight up message bouncing tool, right? It's just a tool that's bouncing messages between cars. There's no security whatsoever. Then that theoretically, the guy in the middle, the vehicle in the middle, will be able to modify the information going to that first vehicle. Yeah,
right.
That's what I said before. If we're going to use something like this, which I would be down for, it would have to be very generic, static information.
Yeah.
Weather, right? Upcoming traffic scenarios.
Yeah.
We could even keep it as simple as kind of like how NORAD has DEFCON. You could have like, okay, Highway I-95 has, it's at a DEFCON of 3. That means that there's about an hour long of traffic, whatever. But once you start to create custom messages or custom payloads in any environment, but on an open mesh network like this, it could be problematic. I don't think that would be a great idea.
Right. So I just want to pause here for a second. For the listeners, please go ahead and start putting your questions, depositing your questions in the chat. I'll ask a few more questions to Hector, and then we'll open up the chat for Q&A. So please go ahead and start typing your questions in the chat. So let's talk about blockchain. Right? This is kind of a blockchain consortium. I mean, I know you're familiar with the blockchain space. I still remember you saying that the FBI still has your Bitcoin in there, and we joked about going there and stealing your laptop. What have you been following about blockchain, especially with regards to cybersecurity, OT security, and other kinds of things?
I mean, I'll be honest with you. It really depends on how you look at it. I mean, if you want to be, if you're approaching it from like a general security practitioner, someone that's just been here in the industry for quite some time, they've seen all the ebbs and flows and changes in all sorts of industries and whatever. You would say that for the most part, blockchain security is what it is. I mean, it's been the same as it was a year ago and the year before. There have been changes made to the code base. The Bitcoin project developers have been doing a great job of keeping it modern and making sure that they're implementing what they said they were going to implement. And but it's no more secure or less secure than it was when we first talked about it, right?
Yeah.
I think the major difference is that now we're seeing a bunch of different protocols being released to the world based off of Ethereum. You have like DeFi and decentralized contracts. You have all this stuff that is probably too complicated for the common person. And this is why you're seeing a lot of contract security issues where
exactly.
A developer creates like a DeFi contract, and the contract has like a very slight, very, and I apologize for my language, very stupid, a logic error that allows anyone to essentially withdraw all tokens from that contract. We've seen that plenty of times, right? Is it related to Bitcoin and blockchain? No, right?
Sure.
But we're seeing a lot of that. I personally have been following the Flow blockchain. I like Flow. I think Flow is really cool, especially for NFTs and stuff like that. I got into the NFT. Oh,
you did? Okay.
I did.
You didn't buy any of those digital art projects, did you?
No, but I got into Top Shot, the NBA Top Shot. So I like sports. Yeah. Top Shot was very cool, but it's not decentralized, right? It's centralized. Yeah. You cannot pull a Top Shot moment from topshot.com or NBA topshot.com and put in like OpenSea or something, right? You can't. I can't give it to you, right? Outside of the website. So it's definitely a hybrid, okay? But it works. So
but have people talked to you about, hey, how can we use blockchain for cybersecurity or securing some stuff? Have people approached you with that question?
Yeah. People have, but and I think this is something you said. Maybe we've discussed it, but the problem is that people are confusing blockchain with like a database, right? And so what they're thinking they need is probably just a MySQL database. They don't need this ledger. They don't need a decentralized ledger. They don't need that at all. So when people do ask me those questions, I guarantee you 9 out of 10 is they need a database, right? I'm just being 100% honest with you. They're not because they don't understand the technology. They haven't read, Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper. They haven't read the following preceding white papers and documentation of what the blockchain can be used for and what it shouldn't be used for. Right?
Okay. Yeah. So we have a first set of questions, Hector. So the participant asked to remain anonymous, but wanted to ask these questions. Okay, all right. So there's 3 questions. Number 1, what is the hardest security architecture to hack? And then the second question, let me do 1 and 2, and then we can get into 3. So number 1, what is the hardest security architecture to hack? And then number 2, what would you recommend for securing IoT at the edge when security scripts and tools don't exist? For example, vehicle telematics data exchange with DOT or US DOT government infrastructure. So they seem to be quite different questions, but go ahead. You want to answer the first one?
All right, so what's the hardest security architecture to hack into? One that is not connected to the internet. That would be the obvious answer. If you tell me to break into the pager infrastructure, more likely will not be able to get access to that. But no, all jokes aside, man, it's like, I mean, it is a great question because it's like, well, what is not hackable, right? What is not compromisable? What is hacking? What is compromising? What is your baseline security model? Or what is it exactly that is that you're looking for? At the end of the day, it feels like regardless of whatever we say, whatever we do, however we implement it, we are all compromised in one fashion or another. Mm-hmm. I've yet to see an environment that wasn't compromised by some person. In fact, I remember an old joke, a developer's joke, that eventually the hello, when you learn a programming language.
Yeah, hello world.
And it's like hello world, right?
Yeah.
I remember there's an old joke that said eventually hello world will be vulnerable. There will be a vulnerability associated with that application. So I mean, it's a hard question. It's a philosophical question. If you want to be honest. So I don't really have an answer for that one. But the second one was what?
Oh, what the second one is, what would you recommend for securing IoT at the edge when security scripts and tools don't exist? It's talking about IoT at the edge, right? The edge devices.
Yeah. Well, you got to look at it like this, right? So I am on the offensive side where I'm looking at, let's say, a device. Okay, let's say I'm connected to, an internal network that has deployed an IoT device. That IoT device connects back into that network through a VPN or something, or some other form of tunneling.
Yeah.
So how would I look at the security of that device? How would I protect it? And that's the thing is like, so long as you have an understanding of the risk of that device, what that device is running. For example, if you're running an embedded device that you've developed from scratch, you know exactly what's running on there. The only software you're running is, like, let's say VPN software is WireGuard. The truth of the matter is that I don't think there's a real good answer for that. I mean, maybe I'm too cynical, right? Maybe I'm too cynical, but it almost seems like any device that's connected to a network that's accessible by anyone should be compromised in some way at some point in time. The best thing you could do is try to, do what organizations do when they look at like the risk assessment or risk analysis. They do the little questionnaire. Well, what's the worst case scenario? What's the worst thing that can happen if this device is compromised? Well, what can they do once they compromise the device? What's actually running on the device, right? Okay, well, the device is only running, this specific set of software. Let's say it's for turning off a light on and off. Okay. Well, what's the worst case scenario if someone does compromise the device and they're able to turn the light on, right? Is it even worth at that point defending, or do we want to defend it? Well, what's the next step? Well, how can they get access to that device over the network, over the wire? Well, they would need to get access to like the edge provider. So that's one area to look at. They would have to look at communications. How would they communicate with the device? Or is there even a way to communicate with the device? The point is another great question. I mean, whoever this person is, they ask some great questions, but these questions are those that are just more philosophical than anything.
Yeah, I mean, he's got a third question, which is also touches into the whole tunneling thing and edge devices. Sure. We're all working from home now, right? Oh, yeah. So we're all edge devices right now, sort of. So his third question is, what would you advise to public, private, academic organizations for work from home strategy, VPN, RDC, etc.?
Yeah, well, I mean, you definitely need some sort of VPN technology. You first off, you need the encryption so that so let's take it back, right? I feel that if you are going to, I'm talking about corporation side, right? Academic is different. Right. So from the corporation side, if you have employees, if you have Rajat working from home, then Rajat should have a laptop specific to your business, provided by the business, that's secured by your administrators, right? They should have some sort of a remote management software, or maybe it's kind of like a remote thin client, whatever, right? The point is that when Rajat opens that computer up with a laptop, he's connected to your network, or he can access your network, or can connect to your network, has to enter some sort of MFA, and then voila, beautiful, right? Um, Now, at that point, with your endpoint security configuration, with your EDRs or whatever, you're taking responsibility for that worker system. It's making sure it's secure. Maybe it may even be read only, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's something like I know AWS is. I know Google has Google Workspace. AWS has something else. AWS has something like AWS Office or something, where it creates a virtual office space, and you kind of log into your browser, yeah. And
Yeah.
it's essentially read only. You can't modify the system. You can't backdoor it. You can't get backdoored. I would go that route, right? For
Mhm.
example, me as someone as a on I would say the department lead, I have a bunch of interns coming in, and I will be providing them laptops or some sort of devices,
Mhm.
and I want to make sure that I know and my team knows exactly what's the worst case scenario. If these people are if these interns or employees are compromised, can the attackers get access to my network? And if so, um, how? Right. So now we go into VPN. I'm a big fan of WireGuard. WireGuard is a new VPN only because, aside from its speed and much cleaner code base, I got really sick of open VPN. All right, no offense to any open VPN developers here, but I really got sick of it. So I would use like something like a WireGuard. I would create a solid VPN connection back into the network, and I would require MFA. I would also, going back to the person that asked this question, I would also look at access controls and identity management. I would really take advantage of Okta that's providing a lot of that stuff because I want to be able to limit the kind of access that my employees have. Now, from the academic side, that's complicated. Because from the academic side, most of it is open source. There's not a lot of funding. And again, at that point, it's just VPN access if possible. If not, but that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah, it's mostly VPN access when I was university days. It's like um that usually is, and then they would give us like approved antivirus software and things like that, but that's about it. There's another question coming in. Hold on. Same person. Well, he's asking very interesting questions for you, Hector. So he asks, he or she, today very little policy exists for security. For example, ISPs are not required to provide even basic level of security. Once upon a time, when ISPs were learning to stand up internet access to the masses, everything open seems logical. It's 2021, yet ISPs are deploying open networks to residents in mass. Perhaps not a lucrative target, but for an enemy of the country could access deposit malware to shut down the people if there was ever another war. So what then should the government be considering in terms of cybersecurity policy? Yes, thank you for your answers.
This is a great question. And thank you so much for this kind person for asking some great questions there. So we do have a problem in our country. I love my country. I know you do as well. But we have some major issues. And I don't even talk about political. We have a rather large infrastructure, yeah, specific to the internet. A lot of it is outdated. The ISPs are doing their best to modernize the infrastructure. There's a lot of conversations that are being had, but cybersecurity is probably one of the ones that, for a long time, weren't really, wasn't really a lucrative concept or a lucrative topic to discuss because it's going to cost a lot of money to tackle the issue. Personally, I'm someone that approaches cybersecurity from the academic side. I think education is very important. I think that anyone in this conversation, if we're talking about, how hey Hector, how can I secure my laptop? And I'll sit here for the next 20 minutes telling you every single thing from A to Z. And then then Rajat records this and uploads it to the internet. Now we're helping not only this one person to ask a question, we're helping hopefully hundreds. But also, it's not demystified enough, right? It's not demystified enough because when you look at journalists on the news, look at these people that talk about cybersecurity incidents. Well, look what happened to Colonial Pipeline, right? And the hackers got in and they did a ransomware, and that's it. There's no technical information. There's no details as to what happened.
Yeah.
Let's stop playing games with the general audience and stop acting like the general audience is too stupid to understand the concepts, right? Even if some things are foreign to our audience, to our fellow Americans, then let's use examples. So I'll give you an example for the Colonial Pipeline incident. Somebody broke into a truck down at the truck stop at the gas station while the driver was in the bathroom. Yeah. And they put one of those driving wheel, the old locks that you put on the wheel.
Yeah.
You need a key to open it. Okay, so here's a news article for you. Truck driver went to the truck stop. He's carrying about $500,000 in equipment, iPhones. He went to the bathroom at the truck stop. Someone broke into his truck and they put that little thing on the wheel and they put a key in there and they left a message. If you do not pay me, if you do not leave $100 by the bathroom stall, you won't get the key. Right. Okay, there's your ransomware. That's your ransom attack. Let's start to communicate more. Now, what can the government do in case of a major cyber war, cyber conflict, or whatever? Right now, I don't think much. The only thing that we could possibly do, and it's going to sound extreme, and I apologize, ladies and gents, it's just to shut off the internet, just to disconnect us from the world, right? But even then, we're still open to internal attacks. Okay. So even if you block off, and this is a reference to Tunisia, when I was participating in
I was going to ask you about your Tunisia experience.
Yeah. So and this could correlate here, guys. Just bear with me. But in the Tunisian operation, during the Arab Spring, I had compromised. Again, I'm not glorifying any of this, please. I'm not glorifying this stuff. But I had compromised elements of the Tunisian government and their infrastructure. And I shut down communications, their government communications, emails, and cell phone access. And their response was, well, we're going to shut off the internet. But they really didn't. What they did was they disconnected their internet from the global internet. Yeah. So it was still possible to access Tunisian internet from within Tunisia. So we had somebody who connected from the Tunisian internet onto IRC on a dial-up modem, on their little dial-up phone. They sent me a message like, hey, Hector, at the time, hey, Sabu, I'm in Tunisia. The internet is dead, but we could access stuff inside. How can we help? How can I help? And I said, well, let me do a remote desktop to your computer. And I did a reverse remote desktop onto his computer. And I was able to compromise the Tunisian president's website. It was really stupid. Through that dial-up connection. It was extremely slow. So the threats are still there, right? Especially if we have the aggressors here within our borders.
Yeah.
We need, here's some more issues to deal with. We do not have enough law enforcement that deals with cyber. The FBI is overloaded, right? So for every ransomware attack that we're seeing in the news, the FBI is having less and less resources to dedicate to that, okay? Our sheriffs and police departments barely have any cyber programs across the country. I know the NYPD does. I know LA does, but does a small town in Ohio does, right? Do the North Dakotan Police Department have a cyber division? They probably do, but can they scale, right? Yeah. When you look at stuff like Alaska, we know there's at least one missile silo. And we know that at the very least, someone's going to attack Alaska in a cyber war to try to, either destroy or deploy a missile, ICBM, yeah? Is there enough people involved to help secure that? Is that infrastructure connected to the internet anyway? These are a lot of questions, and unfortunately, the answer is, well, we don't know, and more than likely, there is no good answer to this. How do you secure a country, Rajat?
Yeah. So I want to come back to your comment earlier about cybersecurity being such a young industry and it has not matured, right? And you talk about doing more of a grassroots, like bottom-up approach, educating everyday people about cybersecurity. And so my question is like, how to mature that industry. Is it going, is it educating people on cybersecurity, even teaching kids about general security? My kids use ton of IT resources that I don't even use, right? So, and they're talking with all kinds of people in the on the chat boxes these days. So, and they're using the downloading apps and all that stuff. So, what's the bottom up approach here?
Well, it is going to be education. There's going to be a lot of conversations just like this. These kind of conversations are going to go a long way until people are sick of hearing it. How many times have you heard about password security, Rajat?
A lot.
And has it improved your stance on password security? Like, are your passwords strong enough now?
No.
That's not good.
No, I may use like few more characters, like uppercase and some exclamation marks, but I mean, we still prefer to use short ones, right?
Yeah. Well, again, it kind of comes down to like risk management or risk analysis. If someone breaks into my random, whatever website account, is that going to really affect me? It may, if you use a short password for like your bank account, right? Yeah. Or even if you're using something else that connects to you, like let's say your T-Mobile account, right? But the truth of the matter is that like something like a password security, where it's such a simple concept that we've talked about it nonstop for 10 years straight. People are still having problems with the passwords.
Yeah.
This is why Microsoft, for example, has been kind of leading the way into getting rid of passwords. I mean, that's part of Microsoft's strategy over the next several years is to eliminate passwords in general. So now your question will be, well, what are they going to replace it with? Well, that's what they're experimenting with. They're using all sorts of like MFA type things. For example, I know with Google, right? If you have a Google Android phone and you try to log into your email, right? You get an alert on your phone that's connected to this account that it'll require a pop-up. It'll require for you to click a yes. This is my device. This is me attempting to log in.
Right.
Before you can log into that account. And so Microsoft is experimenting with that. They've already implemented that. People are talking about using physical devices, kind of like the old RSA keys.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, the password thing is going to be like, well, what do we do with this? Now, the reason why I bring this up is because, we need to set some sort of baseline. There's got to be some sort of threshold where people have a basic understanding of the security issues that they're facing. And then at that point, they can make a decision whether or not to secure their personal lives or not. When you speak to someone that's deep in the cybersecurity industry and they talk about operational security, I also like to point out it's equally important to invest in personal security. Yeah.
Right.
So there's.
Yeah. There's one more question. I don't know the name of the person. So it says, wonder if hackers create AI bots that they lose control over. How can an agency defend from sophisticated bots that continues to morph? I've been hearing about these hackers using bots now, right? So do some sophisticated stuff.
That's a great question. They've been, I would say adversaries have been using bots for quite some time, a very long time. In fact, even in my days, in I would say mid to late 90s, people were using they were creating kind of like DOS botnets. It's always been a thing. In fact, it goes back to the Morris worm in 1988 when Robert Morris created the Morris worm, or the worm that essentially almost shut down the entire internet. That's how effective it was. An AI bot, here's the thing. A lot of what you hear about, kind of like what we talked about before, I think it was a point about the blockchain. The people who think that they know what they want to use a blockchain for usually don't, and they're looking for something else. I don't think that a lot of the AI stuff that you see today is actually AI, right? Can an attacker create kind of like a self-modifying, self-distributing malware or bot that'll create some sort of mesh network? Yes, absolutely. What if they lose control of it? What if the author drops dead? Then what?
Yeah.
Right? Well, then it's up to the global community to start shutting the bot down. We've seen this with Microsoft and the FBI. We've seen this with Microsoft with ICE, and Microsoft with Interpol, and Microsoft has done a good job at working with law enforcement to shut down massive botnets around the world. and it'll be the same exact thing. The only way it'll be complicated is if the botnet is decentralized and kind of like a mesh particle, similar to what we discussed before.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of one that was decentralized. Code Red, back in the early 2000s, there was a massive botnet that literally slowed down the internet for everybody. And it was called Code Red. And some genius decided, well, I want to be a vigilante. I want to fix this. So they created Code Blue. And Code Blue did the same exact thing that Code Red did, which was infect servers on the internet and then scan the rest of the internet for more vulnerable servers and infect those servers. And they just kept going round and round. And they were not centralized. They were kind of crazy. And it kind of goes back to this question. What would happen if an author creates some sort of botnet and kind of loses control of it? That's what Code Red and Code Blue were.
Right.
But they were eventually shut down.
Yeah. Okay, we're closing up on our time. It's 10:19, 10:20. I don't see any more questions. I do have a question for you, Hector. It's like, so before this call, you and I talked about, what can a consortium like MOBI help the automotive industry and mobility industry. How can the consortium like this play a role in cybersecurity? Basically, from the fact that most of the big companies are here on the same table in the same room, right? So, what are, let's say, 3 things or 4 things that they can do?
Well, I would say that continue the conversation. Let's definitely continue to meet up. I would say that that's key because that's going to build your community. It's going to expand your community, and we want to see more of that. But also, it doesn't have to be all automotive. You should definitely look at other industries. For example, I know you guys work with logistics industries and so on. Why not just bring in logistics folks to come in and talk about their issues, if it's specific to cybersecurity? Yeah. Because it'll give some good perspective. I'm a cybersecurity guy, so I'm gonna focus on that part of the question. Sure. Now, as for security issues, common security issues, what I think needs to happen is this: you take something like a MOBI. Whenever there's a brand new cybersecurity incident specific to automotive technology, that information should be disseminated. Whether it's going to be a newsletter, whether it's going to be in the monthly meeting or weekly meeting, let's talk about it.
Great idea. Yeah. And
if you guys do not understand, for example, with Rajat, if there's a big story that came out and you don't really understand the concepts, bring me in, call Hector, or bring in Charlie Miller, or call in Sammy Kamkar. You bring in all these different researchers, or even reach out to the researchers that work at these automotive industry providers. You look at the Fiats and the Toyotas and Hondas, and talk to their security personnel. Hey, I have a question. So this is a big story that came out. What can we do? What does it mean, right? The third thing I would say is, definitely. I think that's pretty much it for me. Those first 2 are most interesting to me. And there's one thing that's important, ladies and gents, and that is that, what I was trying to say before, the important point for me, and this goes back to the question, the last question was asked, how do we secure our borders, essentially, our cyber borders, if you want to call it that? We need more people, right? We need more people to join the industry, to learn, to want to be practitioners, because it not only is going to benefit me, it's going to benefit you. And that means talking to your sons, your daughters, your nieces, nephews, your neighbors. If you know someone that's 19 years old and they're working at Wendy's and they dropped out of college and they're not really sure what they want to do with their lives, you can tell them, hey, did you know that there's an industry that's still brand new and you can make yourself about $100,000 a year, literally in your first or second year? I guarantee you're gonna get interest, right? If it's about money, talk about money. There's a lot of money. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry and it's still very young. It's not even stopping anytime soon.
Yeah.
And if it's not about money, if it's people that want to be patriotic, well, you know what? We have a major problem. We cannot secure our infrastructure. We're not there yet, and we don't have the capabilities to, unless we want to shut down the internet. Okay.
Right.
But for your organization, my last point would be, just keep doing what you're doing and keep bringing on people like myself. And preferably more nerds, right? You bring a nerd in, we could talk for the next 3 hours.
Yeah.
And just kind of keep it up. you know.
Yeah, certainly with you. You can go for another 4 hours.
We'll be here 4 hours. I'll take a nap and everything. Could wake up like, oh, yeah, one more point.
One more question. Yeah,
One
yeah.
more question. No.
All right, let's see. I'm out of questions, so let's see if there's any more messages coming out
All
in the
right.
chat box. Well, there's none.
I think I put them to sleep.
I don't think so.
But yeah,
I don't have further questions. So you know, guys, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We still have about 7 minutes to go.
yeah. Well, you know, so what we're waiting for questions here, I would say that you know, the thing that I found to be very useful is speaking to people that are not specifically in your part of the industry. I'll give you an example. If I were to speak to if I wanted to chop up and talk about security in an organization, I did this a couple of years ago with a client where by the way, their structure was all crazy, but not in a bad way. For example, their security department did not work under like their CISO, right? Or the CIO. It actually worked on the legal department. So now they had to answer to the lawyers rather than answer to, you know, some corporate entity, you know, the corporate employee.
Yeah, yeah.
And so when we had a meeting to discuss their security posture, there's one thing that legal department did that blew my mind. Okay. That is, they invited me, they invited the head of security, their CISO, their CTO, their CIO, but they also invited their network engineer that was not in security. They invited their head developers, you know, of QA and testing and so on. And we even brought in like the head of IT support, which is not a security person at all.
Yeah.
And so what are we talking about? We had a really good conversation among peers about the general security posture of the organization. And it wasn't just me in an echo chamber with another security personnel. Now we expanded that organization. That's the best thing I learned from that legal department. These lawyers really thought outside the box. Maybe that's something that other organizations can do as well.
Sure. That's a great idea. Yeah, I agree.
Oh, yeah.
All right. It's a comment from Christine. Great discussion today. Thank you, Christine, for attending. It's a comment it's a question from the Fatigue. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correct. He asks, or she asks, how can you use code and transmission matching on multiple blockchain nodes to detect intrusions? That's definitely your question. Question for you.
Yeah, that's beyond my pay grade. Very good.
How can you use code and transmission matching?
I mean, that sounds cool.
What's the transmission matching? Do you know?
Sounds cool.
Sounds cool. Sorry, we don't have an answer for you.
Yeah. All right. Well, this was a good conversation, man, for sure. You know, definitely, you know, reach out to me if you guys ever want to chop it up and chat it up. You guys could always find me on LinkedIn if you have any questions, or even that last question right there. You know, give me 5 minutes. I'll do my research and I'll gladly hit you up. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn and we can have a conversation about it.
Yeah, he's so. By the way, Hector is in LinkedIn. He's pretty active in there. So if you have further questions that you cannot ask here, go ahead and hit him with those questions. So let's close the session today. Thank you so much, Hector, for joining in, and thank you all the participants for joining in. I hope you learned a lot. All right, Kelly, back to you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. It's a great conversation, and thanks everyone for attending. We appreciate it. And be sure to check out our website page on innovation lectures for upcoming lectures. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Hector. Bye.